Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. We can see you coming in. The numbers of participants are slowly increasing. If you feel like it, you can use the chat function to tell us where you're joining us from. I see Veronica, hi from Philadelphia. I see hello from Boston, Seattle, Colorado, Amherst, Virginia. Wow, Rome. Toronto, Minnesota. Wow, this is going so fast. I can't even read all of these. Welcome everybody to our first webinar for the year 2023. We're happy to launch this free webinar series. My name is Carola. I'm one of the trainers here at CCC, and I will be your host for the day. As many of you know, we are going to be recording this presentation. It will be available a couple of days after today so that you can watch it again online if you feel like it. There are other recordings of our past webinars, which can also be found on our online learning platform. We will share that link in the chat with you in a little bit. And we also have many webinars coming up within this free series, as well as other workshops with the wonderful trainers that we have. My colleague Andrew is going to support us today. He's mainly going to be monitoring the chat function to make sure that we can answer questions in there. We are going to answer questions related to CCC in the chat. If you have specific questions about the presentation, please post those in the Q&A box. I will be monitoring that, and at the end of the presentation, we will get to those. Couple of things as a reminder. The webinar will be about 45 minutes long, and then we'll have about 15 minutes for questions. If you have specific comments, as I mentioned, for CCC, you can put those in the chat. If you have questions about the presentation, please put those in the Q&A function, and I will ask those in my role as moderator to our presenters later on. You can use the chat function if you need to contact the panelists directly. You can send a message to us, or you can send a message to everyone to be looking at this. As you all know, this webinar has been approved for CEUs. You will receive an email tomorrow around the same time as today with a link to a Dropbox folder in which you will be able to download your certificate. There's also going to be a link to a short survey. We really appreciate all of you who complete the survey so that we know what topics you would like us to bring to you during this webinar series. And now, without further ado, let's begin this webinar, Side Translation from the Point of View of Receivers. We are delighted and honored to welcome Laurence, Ibrahim Aibo, and Cristiano Mazzei. They both are certified translators and interpreters, have tons of years of experience teaching and working as interpreters and as translators. They both co-authored the publication, The Routledge Guide to Teaching Translation and Interpreting Online, which was published by Routledge in the year 2022. And Cristiano is the director of the Online Certificate in Professional Translation and Interpreting at UMass Amherst. So welcome to both of you. Thank you for sharing your experience, your vast experience in the field with us today. And I will pass the baton over to you.
Thank you, Carola. I'm going to share my screen. Welcome, everybody. It's wonderful to see people from all over the world. Please confirm that you can see my slides. Cristiano, maybe you can nod so that I know that
yes,
my slides.
Yep,
Excellent.
we're good.
Excellent. Okay.
Okay, so let's get started. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for being here. We'll have time for Q&A at the end, and we're going to get started. So our presentation, we will talk briefly about definitions, skills, and settings. I'm going to touch on briefly on some strategies that you can practice on your own to improve your delivery and side translation skills. And we're going to talk about guidelines that are out there, not only in the United States, but other places around the world. And then we're going to have a conversation about the point of view of the receivers of sight translation. So hopefully that will give us a lot of food for thought, and you have a lot of questions for us. So in terms of definitions, we're using here at Wallace Chan from 2015 article in which he defines sight translation as the oral translation of a written text. I know that most of you already know what that is. So the translator reads a written text, or the interpreter processes its meaning quickly, and then orally translates the text while it's still being read. So that's very important, because the eyes of the interpreter, as they are sight translation, are constantly traveling and reading ahead and that sort of thing. And then in terms of settings, I would like to take this opportunity and ask you, if you have done sight translation in one of your assignments or more, what kind of documents were you asked to sight translate? What has been your experience? So please type in the chat box, what kind of documents and what kind of setting were you asked to perform sight translation? So
we see medical consent forms, court forms, patient discharge, rent, medical forms, surgeries, consent legal documents, police reports, in church, IEP goals, a plea agreement, discharge, guilty plea form, medical and legal documents are ARDs, which are the similar to IEPs in Texas, educational resources, imaging, medical questions, AVS, immigration forms, assessment reports.
Thank you, everybody.
Privacy
This is awesome.
policies.
This is awesome. Thank you for your participation. I'm very happy to see that you guys have had the experience. So as we can see from the chat, a lot of the examples came from what we call community settings in the United States and Canada, but other parts of the world, you refer to this area as public service interpreting and translation. So some of the examples are from asylum, immigration hearings, letters, statements, police interviews, as many of you indicated, in healthcare settings, medical records. Sometimes they're handwritten, sometimes they're typed. So the handwritten ones will add a complexity to the task, prescriptions, follow-up, post-op instructions. And in the court setting, indictments, sentencing orders, and what we have seen with the increase of social media and technology, a lot of sight translation in the courtroom being done for social media posts and also instant messages on WhatsApp and other types of communication platforms. So thank you so much. So the expectation of everyone, the receivers, both the institutional and the client that needs the interpretation, is that they receive a message that fulfills a communicative purpose. And we can talk about quality, what quality really means. And there are three components there. First, that it's faithful to the original message. No addition, no omission, no editing, no changes. There is an expectation that the language is cohesive, that it's understandable. Again, there is this idea that you're oralizing a written text, and these are two different types of signs, right? There's the written sign with its own norms and guidelines. And then we have the oral sign, oral language sign, which also has different norms to follow. And then there's the expectation regarding delivery in terms of volume, enunciation, expressiveness, liveliness, and in terms of skills, no backtracking, not too many pauses. So in general, this is the expectation of folks regarding receiving sight translation. And then we're going to talk a little bit now about skills and knowledge. As you would imagine, public speaking, because you're oralizing a written message, is very important. So public speaking skills, silent and fast reading and comprehension, chunking of information, especially for sentences that have a lot of embedded clauses and are very long. Interpreters need to practice on this chunking skill. Paraphrasing, which requires a very wide vocabulary base in both languages, right? You can only paraphrase something if you have a wide vocabulary. Register manipulation, expanding and condensing, domain knowledge, right? The more you know about that particular topic, that domain, the better you'll be able to perform. If it's something completely new to you that you've never seen before, chances are you're not going to do, those expectations that we talked about in the previous slide are not going to be met. Understanding cultural nuance is also extremely important. And then there's this next slide that shows skills in a different light from different authors. They divide the skills into hard skills and into soft skills. And then you can see in the hard skills part, excellent language proficiency. We must never forget that language proficiency, advanced language proficiency, is a requirement for translation and interpreting in all of the modes. Effective memorization capacity. There is a level of memory capacity for sight translation that you need to store to be able to continue performing sight translation. A broad knowledge base, analytical skills. And then they introduce this idea of you also need to develop these soft skills or to have the motivation, confidence. We want the interpreter to sound confident when they're providing sight translation, and psychological stamina, which is a part of interpreting in general as well. And then I'm going to just give you just a few, and you probably have heard this before, how to get better at sight translation. There are some things you can do to practice at home. This comes from an article that we have included in the reference at the end of the presentation. So fast reading, how to improve fast reading, so try to read, pick up a short text. You can pick it up from a newspaper, or when you're sitting waiting for your doctor's appointment, pick up something from the table that's there, a short text, skim it, read it really fast, give yourself 20 seconds, and then stop and try recalling the main points of the story. And then repeat and try with several different short texts as well. So skim the text, close your eyes, and then try to recall the main points of that story. And the idea of repeat has a lot to do with skills development. Repeat, do it again, and keep going. And then another one that has to do with vocabulary expansion. You can try to just look at the headline, look at the title of a story, and you can do this with your family at home, and just tell a story based on the title. If you have a wide vocabulary, you'll be able to construct a story based on the title, even if it's different from the story that the title refers to. That is a good exercise nevertheless. And again, repeat and do it again, and so on. And the other one is paraphrasing, which again, as I said, relies a lot on a wide vocabulary base. Pick up a short text and try oralizing it, but using different words and different terms. So paraphrase that story as you go. And you can do all of this in the same language. You can do that in English. If English is one of your languages, you can do that English, and then you can also try to do it in your language other than English as well. So here are just a few ideas of, to improve your practice. And now I think moving on, I'm going to hand it over to Laurence for the next part.
Yes, thank you very much, Chris. Can you hear me properly? Yes?
Yes.
I suppose so. So, moving on to the next part. In this next part, I'm going to talk about different guidelines and standards of practice in different settings, starting with healthcare. So let's start here in the United States. So what does the National Council on Interpreting in Healthcare tells us in terms of recommendations, of guidelines? The interpreter should avoid site translation if they lack specific site translation skills. And then there's an illustration about a consent form. What should we do in such settings? What should the clinician do in such settings, right? In other regions, still in healthcare, there's national standards for community interpreting services.
Laurence, sorry to interrupt. Some people are asking you to speak up just a little bit.
Okay,
And
yes.
I'm also going to say you guys can turn on the caption at the bottom where you see more on your Zoom screen. You have the option of turning on the caption.
Okay, I'll try to project my voice and let me know if it's a little bit better now. So I'll make a conscious effort about volume. So the second example of guidelines we are looking at the bottom of this slides are from the National Standard Guide for Community Interpreting Services in Canada. And this is a little bit more specific. So they're talking about more specifically about healthcare. And what I found interesting here, not only are they recommending that site translation be kept for simple documents, they also mention that specialized healthcare documents require a different skill set and a different setting. So that specialized healthcare documents should be translated in writing. And the reason is because they require a lengthy research process, right? So the concept of time, it requires a lot of time, is important here, because when we are site translating, this is done on the spot, right? So we don't have extensive time to devote to preparing. So let's take a look at another set of guidelines, and I find those interesting. They are from the Australian Institute of Interpreters and Translators, so in Australia, and those guidelines are not necessarily for interpreters. They are directed at clinicians, right? So healthcare personnel. So they are more specific. Those guidelines are more specific in that they say that site translation should be used sparingly and for brief document. But what does brief mean, right? It's like accuracy. What does accuracy mean? So brief documents, they give us a range between 200 and 300 words. And they specify that interpreters should not be required to site translate consent forms. I think we've talked about consent forms in the chat. Some of you stated that they had to site translate consent forms, complex medical documents, etc. So in a nutshell, anything that is long, complex, technical, right, are a no-no for site translation purposes, and instead they require written translation. So let's move on to a different type of setting, guidelines and standards of practice in educational settings. I'm sure many of you work in these settings, and I know that other sets of guidelines, standards of practice, and codes of ethics are currently being developed, which is very good news. So let's take a look at what the Minnesota Department of Education's Codes of Ethics and Standards of Practice says. So they do recommend that lengthy, complicated documents should be translated in writing, if the family reads. And so the notion of written literacy is important. We are going to talk about it later on. Okay. Moving on to court settings, starting with the Nadjit's position paper on modes of interpreting. So the focus here is to give the interpreter sufficient time to review the content of the document. So this is the focus of Nadjit's indisposition paper. The California court system is a little bit more specific. They state that if site translation must happen, the document must be relatively short, and second, the translator must be confident that they can do it, right? The requirement is accuracy, so a length, terminology, and complexity of sentence structure could jeopardize accuracy. And in that case, then the interpreter should state that they are not comfortable doing site translation, and then there will be a written translation prepared. I want to pause just a second to show you alternative positions on site translation. I found this very intriguing, so I started researching. I was not able to find this specific code of ethics, but it has been brought up in different articles and papers and chapters. Apparently, there's some ethical codes in Belgium, right, in Flanders, that prohibit this practice. So this got me curious, but I couldn't find something specific for this webinar, but it's interesting to bring it up and mention it. So still in court settings, let's go back to Australia and take a look at Queensland Court's guidelines. And there's a different concept or something new that was new to me. And this concept is sight unseen. Sight unseen is asking the interpreter to do site translation on the spot, which is usually the definition of site translation. Site translation. We are given a document. Someone is requesting us to do site translation without really prior notice. So this is called by Queensland Court sight unseen. Without prior notice, and sight unseen should be avoided for long, complex, or technical documents. So we see that this notion of length, complexity, and technical or specialized documents are brought up or specified or referred to in many guidelines or code of ethics or standards of practice, right? So we want to ask you something. We have another prompt for you, and this one is for you, Chris, right?
Yeah, so we are asking you guys to participate again. So try to remember the last time you performed site translation in your different settings, and try to remember if you noticed, especially in the LEP, the limited English proficient individual, which is in a US term to say the non-English speaker, the client that's receiving the interpretation, try to remember if you saw in the person receiving the interpretation, the site translation, signs of disengagement, signs of confusion, or if they were simply bored. So tell us, try to remember last time you did site translation, if you notice that the limited English proficient individual was disengaged, looked confused, or looked completely bored. So I can see a lot of all of it. Carol, I think you're muted if you're trying to.
And
Yes.
the question is, what did you do?
So we can see bored, a lot of confusion, a lot of all three. Then some have say no, not at all, but definitely disengaged and confused because of the complexity of terminology, frustration. Yes, all three, confused, but being polite, all of the above, disengaged as well as bored. So
yeah, so the
confusion
question
and
is,
boredom.
yeah, the question for those who said they didn't notice anything, were you doing something in particular that kind of engaged the listener, or if you did notice boredom, did you do something to change that dynamic? Did you do anything that would engage the listener more, or did you just continue on, plowed on, and until you finished your task? Some people are saying changed register,
Yeah,
eye contact from time to time.
trying to catch their attention, checking in for understanding, and slow down the pace, refrain from adding or expanding, involving the provider. That might be also an interesting solution. The tone of voice, use more body language, pause and ask the patient if they understood, change the register, ask if the listener was following, clarifying, continued and checked for understanding. You need to be engaging in the delivery, paraphrasing, good technique when it comes to boredom.
Thank you all. This is awesome. Thank
This
you
is
so much for
awesome.
this feedback. Now back to Laurence.
I love the part involving the provider. We are going to talk about that. Thank you so much, all of you, for participating and sharing with us. All right. So let's talk about the meat of today's topic. The audience envisioned as a recipient of information, right? And as a user. So let's start with what's in a name, right? Terminology is so important. Just imagine that instead of translators and interpreters, people would call us language engineers. It would do a lot for our status, professional status. At least this is my guess. So as we mentioned before, in Europe and elsewhere, in other regions of the world, instead of what we use in the United States, which is limited English proficient individual, people use public service user. So this is important because the focus in the US is on a limited ability, maybe a disability. I don't want to go there, but limited proficiency, right? In Europe, in other regions of the world, the focus is on the role, right? The user, and not on the ability. And the user of what? A public service. So they're using a service. So it needs to be put to use. The person needs to be able to use it. And I think it's important to think about what terminology can do, right? So I took a look at a very recent research, and we are going to share with you in the last slides all the references that we used in this webinar. If you're curious or interested, you are going to be able to read it. I strongly recommend it. It's a fascinating study. So in this study, the researcher took a look at how sight translation is different from interpreted dialogue and observed a few things. So first of all, when the interpreter switches to sight translation, the probability of the receiver or the user to ask questions, clarification questions, is much lower. Just because interrupting a person who is reading is much more intimidating than interrupting in a person in a dialogue setting where people are taking turns, right? So readers have primacy over a regular speakers. So this is one thing. The second aspect is that during sight translation, just because of the effort that is needed, the focus of interpreters is usually, it's statistical, more on the text than on the user, on the receiver, the receivers of sight translation. And the third aspect is this sudden switch from a triad to a dyad dynamics. And I would contend that it's a monologue. It becomes a monologue. One person is reading, is doing this sight translation. And this is taken from a study by Hafnan that was published in November 2022. So what it does when the interpreter switches from consecutive interpreting with its turn taking, there will be some disconnection and disengagement. So users or recipients are going to disconnect whenever there's a high information density. There was complex legal terminology, right? And how can we measure the disengagement of users? So it can be measured by different ways. First of all, eye contact, the gaze, expressions, facial expressions, and the absence of nods, right? When we are listening, a lot of people are nodding more or less, right? So usually when eyes are glazing over, there's a blank expression, the person stops nodding, is looking away, or is frowning, right? Frowning is a good way of telling that somebody is struggling to understand something. So these all can be signs that recipients are struggling to focus, and also a signs that users have become bored, right? So this researcher Havnan did this study, filmed different settings where there was a requester, a public service requester, an interpreter, and a public service user. And to be less intrusive, every interaction, every session was filmed, was recorded, and then the focus of this researcher was on the body language of the recipient, right? To see those signs of becoming disengaged, bored, disconnected, etc. So gazes, expressions, absence of nods, people starting fidgeting with a pen, etc. So the problem is that any kind of boredom has consequences on understanding and memory, right? So this calls the question of a sort of disruption, right? Envisioning sight translation as a major disruption. So it disrupts the rhythm of the typical spoken dialogue, right? And it disrupts the turn-taking patterns, right? Instead of having this triangle in a meeting, for example, with only 3 people, the requester, the interpreter, and the recipient, this turn-taking between the 3 parties is disrupted because of sight translation that requires a sort of monologue, right? There's no more turn taking. So what it does in terms of consequences on interactions is that the agency of the requester, after they have requested the sight translation from the interpreter, there's no more agency, right, during sight translation. And the user or the recipient is becoming passive during sight translation. Remember what we said earlier, there's a much lower probability of the recipient of sight translation to dare asking questions and clarifications, right? So the agency becomes the interpreter's agency only during sight translation. Sorry. Going too fast with my slides. Sorry about that. All right, so there are means to counter disengagement, and I think you mentioned all of them in the chat earlier. Thank you again for being so engaged. So there are semiotic resources during site translation that we can use as interpreters, nonverbal aspects. So for example, we can handle the text and move closer to the receiver. We can also adopt a proper body posture and make sure we turn from time to time to the receiver to check for understanding. We can use our gaze, eye contact, the intensity of the gaze and the duration are both important. We could use nods, head movements, and gestures. For example, if we are handling the written document, we could sit or stand next to the recipient and point to specific sections or parts in the written document. This has been proven as an effective strategy. We can use our fingers to number items to simulate countings. First, you will do this, then you will do that. It could be used in post-op instructions, for example. So all these can be used as strategies, and you are already using them. So let's go back to this notion of user. So if I'm a user, how can I use the information that is given to me if I'm in the position, in the role of a user? So let's ask us this question. What will the recipient / user be able to do with the information that they received, right? What are they going to be able to do? These are rhetorical questions. We do not have specific answers. Can complex and or long content be really absorbed and digested via site translation? What will the recipient be able to do when they receive complex, long information with complicated terminology? Is sometimes site translation just a way to check a box? The institution wants to protect themselves from a legal standpoint. And yes, the information was received. Yes, it was conveyed, but was it really received, and how was it perceived? That's the question. And as we all know, is or could site translation sometimes be a way to save money and avoid offering written translations as such? And what about recipients who have no written literacy? Okay, what happens? Is our written translations really the only way to address this kind of situation or this type of content? So maybe we can refer to these rhetorical questions as prompts during the Q&A, but these are only, ideas and food for thought. And I believe Cristiano has parting thoughts, so we'll wrap up this presentation, right?
Yep. So in the next slide, it's just to remind us that, this interpreting studies scholar, Cecilia Vadenjo, in 1992, she published a book titled Interpreting as Interaction, where she explains interpreting as an interactional task. And she kind of equates it with a pas de trois, which is a dance of three. So that's the picture that you see here on the right. This is from a ballet from Brazil, a dance company called Grupo Corpo, where you see three dancers. And Cecilia says in her book that all participants, so all three, in the interpreter-mediated dialogues contribute to meaning making. So they all have a responsibility for that communication. All dance partners must know the steps and agree with which dance they're going to perform. While the interpreter's role in the dance is usually highlighted, the importance of the other interlocutors, of the other participants, is often neglected. And this is what we're trying to say in this presentation as well, that if we want to change something, we need to bring everybody in the conversation.
You're breaking up, Chris, so I'm going to...
Cristiano, we are not
yes.
hearing you.
Yes. You were saying that you want to bring everybody into the conversation, right?
Yes, sorry everybody for my mic. Yeah, so just to wrap this up, we wanted to invite, comments and questions. But, this idea that interpreting is interactional, that it depends on the participants to be able to happen, is really important. And that speaks to the guidelines that Laurence has presented, coming from associations. And then there are protocols. Which protocol do we follow? I saw people asking questions. What is a nice way to refuse to do sight translation? So some of these are very valid questions, but I think the important thing is to bring everybody into the conversation of how to do this better by everybody participating.
Yes, and especially because there are some new codes of ethics and standards of practice and guidelines for such protocols that are currently being designed. So I think it's an important, it's timely to think about the different actors or interlocutors in as we are designing as professionals those guidelines. It's important to bring different people to the table, right? So these are the references or the studies that we refer to. You're going to receive this slide with your certificate of attendance, as Carola mentioned earlier in her introduction, right? So I believe we can stop sharing now to engage in the Q&A, right, Carola?
Yes, wonderful. Thank you for the presentation. And before we go over to the Q&A section, I will answer quickly a couple of questions that several of you have asked during the chat. We are not going to share the PowerPoint. You will receive an email within 24 hours with a link to download your certificate and the references page that Laurence just mentioned. You will be able to enter your own names in the PDF. It is a fillable one, so no worries if you don't think that we don't see your name. We do see your names, we see your questions. So now we're going to move over to the Q&A portion, which I've been looking at and following, and hopefully we will be able to answer as many questions as possible. We do have 15 minutes. We are going to be mindful of time so that whoever needs to leave at 12:30 can leave at 12:30. So first question, is shadowing the best practice exercise to improve sight translation?
I want to, maybe the person could clarify shadowing. In my understanding as an educator, shadowing is when we are listening to something and then repeating it, so that it doesn't play a role in sight translation, right? Because it's a different input. For sight translation, your input is written as opposed to auditory. So,
or maybe English sight translation. Sometimes it's referred to as shadowing, or maybe the person wants to specify it.
Well, we will see if they add something else to the Q&A box. Another question. One very common problem is that they will start translating, which I guess is sight interpreting the text word by word. This is easier, but it's very unnatural and difficult to understand. How can interpreters avoid doing this?
Yeah, I think one idea which I mentioned briefly is this idea of oralize the text, and think about these two sign systems as different sign system. A written text takes a long time to be produced. People think about it, think about the structures. There are norms to follow. There's grammar. So there are different norms to written texts. In oral language, the norms are very different. We can repeat ourselves. We can, as I'm doing here, and I can go like this. You don't see that in written text. So, or trying to oralize it and having in mind this idea that you're turning a written text into an oral one might be helpful.
Great. Thank you for that answer. We have another comment over here that sometimes we are given the consent and privacy forms, which are like 2 to 3 pages long, 1 to 3 pages long. It is very tempting to summarize without reading it all. Any suggestions?
First of all, site translation, summarizing is a no-no. You may not summarize. Summarizing, paraphrasing. Summarizing can be an exercise to practice, but as we doing site translation, we may not summarize. So an alternative is to say, this is the interpreter speaking. If you, the requester, wants to go over the main points, and I will interpret for you, and you lower your hand and you move on. And so switching to consecutive, right?
Yeah, and one of the, if I could add to that, when we summarize something ourselves, we're always doing it from our point of view. Laurence and I can summarize the same text completely different. So, and somebody wrote in the chat asking the provider to summarize, because the provider know what's important in that piece of document. We have a different view of it. So asking the provider to summarize it and then interpreting consecutively or simultaneously is also a good strategy.
Great. Next question is, some of the people mentioned that changing the register was a way to engage the users. Is this allowed?
Oh man, that's a good question. If you
For
look
you,
at
Chris, you are going to take this one.
this is a can of worms. If you look at different standards of practice, especially the ones put out by healthcare organizations, changing the register yourself should not be pursued because you're making changes to the way something was written. And somehow you're changing the meaning. You're giving the listener an impression of something that is not there. It's actually you did it yourself. Changing the register is not recommended by many standards of practice. So I think Laurence, when she introduced the strategies of engagement, kind of propose things that are different from that move away from changing register. That's a little not recommended by guidelines.
We have several questions about how to politely refuse site translations whenever we're asked to do those in several settings, regardless of the settings, I should say.
I'll start taking this one, but I'm sure Cristiano has a lot to add to it. So always make it about the outcome, never about yourself, unless you really think you're not qualified to do this, but always make it about the outcome. We want the best outcome for the purpose of, accuracy and communicating the message. May I suggest that you read the questions one by one, and I will interpret them in the consecutive mode. This way, if the receiver or the recipient has questions, it will be easier. So make it about the outcome, about communication, not about you as the interpreter. This is my personal take. Maybe Cristiano has a different perspective on that.
I just would like to add that this will vary a lot depending on your status as a worker. If you are an independent contractor, if you are a freelance interpreter, translator, or if you are a full-time staff somewhere, there are protocols in place for what is the expectation regarding site translation in different places. So I would say, first of all, follow the protocol that exists. If you are a freelance translator and interpreter, find that out from your agency. I know that it's very difficult from your language service provider who hired you. If you're a staff or a part-time, you probably know the protocol that is available there, and that goes for the courts and goes for the hospitals and other settings.
Great. And this goes hand in hand with the next question, which is site translation even allowed for interpreters to do? Which you have already touched upon this during your presentation, but maybe you want to add a few comments to that.
Yeah, I think Laurence,
Mm-hmm.
Laurence introduced several guidelines where it was not recommended in some instances. So who makes the definition, who makes the decision, right, of what is allowed and not allowed? There are many players in this game. And as I showed that picture of the ballet, all of those folks, all of those participants have a responsibility to come up with a protocol. And if the answer is, from now on, we're not going to allow, it is a decision that is made at the institutional level and so on and so forth.
Yes, and I wanted to add that based on our very brief review of literature, a review of standards or guidelines or protocols, in countries where public service interpreting has a long history, there are more specific guidelines. And they really focus on they are more specific in terms of length of the document. We saw one of the guidelines that mentioned between 200 and 300 words. So this is based on research and observation. So there's no universal guidelines. We are far from that, but we are bound by the settings within which we work, right, as interpreters.
This is an interesting question, I personally find. And the question is whether you are aware if there are any studies comparing site translation done by an interpreter with a service user compared to whether the service user reads the text in their own language. For example, if there's a difference, if, for example, a Spanish speaker receives a translation of the text, if there's any differences, if they read it more thoroughly, if they just skim through it, if they have more questions than if the document is site translated to them, or if something of the sort has been done in the field.
Fascinating question. I'm not aware of that, but I would start digging, and I will. Now that you provoked me.
Exactly.
Chris?
Yeah, same here. I don't have any. Yep.
There are a lot of questions regarding register and if we should try site translate vulgarities as well. Do you want to touch upon that again, or should we move on to the next?
Vulgarities in site translation, I never came across those because usually it's a written text, but maybe vulgarities in social media exchange, right? Maybe Chris, in courts, have you come across those?
I always like to share this example from the judiciary environment. If we change the register, let's imagine that a defendant is illiterate. So this particular defendant has characteristics in their speech that indicate that they are illiterate and also indicate their level of education, their level of critical thinking. As the defendant is being questioned or cross-examined in the courtroom, if the interpreter then decides to change the register and makes that defendant sound like an educated person, sound like that that they have a different background, that will have a huge impact on the jury, because the jury will understand that person through the words of the interpreter, and the register has changed. So now they're seeing someone who's completely different. And if there is a moment where his capacities are necessary to prove that he's guilty, and maybe he's not guilty because he was not able to understand, but then the interpreter made him sound scholarly, then the jury said, oh, this guy is lying. So that's a good example to think about register.
And then I would like to combine two questions that we have here. The first question is of how can you offer any advice on educating providers about the need for intentionality and interactive participation with all three, within all the parties? That is the one. And I think this goes hand in hand with how we can make site translation more engaging instead of just actually sort of dehumanizing the LEP or service user, and if there has been any research done in this regard about this aspect of this sort of dehumanizing the LEP.
I can tackle the first question, and what can we do? From our standpoint in the educational field, as educators, what we can do and what I have done is published articles in this area about the importance of educating providers and working with providers, working with other disciplines, and also designing courses that are for providers, how to work with interpreters. So we have at the University of Massachusetts, we have a course that a lot of nursing students take that's called How to Work with Interpreters. So that's one way from the educational part, how to educate providers on what to expect and what to know about interpreters.
Yes, I'm going to take the dehumanizing portion of the question. So as we saw earlier, what's in a word, terminology is important. So when we are focusing or calling recipients limited English proficient individuals, we are putting the focus on their limitations, a lack. They lack something. All right. So I think it starts with that. How can we re-envision recipients? Maybe if we call them recipients of interpreting services or users of interpreting services, there's a lot to be said about perception, right? We are all language specialists, language engineers. Let's do that. So perceiving the specific use of a word, any terminology has connotation, right? Yes, the recipient is the patient, is the defendant, etc. The person who is receiving interpretation services, right?
Great. Thank you for the answer. We have a lot of questions about refusal, of how to do refusal of site translation. I know you've already touched upon this, but there are a couple that I have found interesting that you might want to address. If an agency, for example, sends you to an assignment as a consecutive interpreter and tells you it's a consecutive interpreting assignment, and then the provider asks you to do a site translation, should you refuse? There's another one. I don't have practice with site translation. As how do I deal with this? How do I deal with long consent forms? How do I deal with legal documents? So I know that you've already touched upon this, but given that we are receiving more and more questions about this, I thought it might be interested to maybe touch upon it briefly one more time. We do have a couple more minutes left before we are going to come to an end, but I just wanted to give you an opportunity to share your final thoughts on that, given that that seems to be something that a lot of the participants here today have on their mind on how to politely refuse.
I would say if you haven't done site translation, or if you haven't developed the skill yet, please do, because site translation is not only a mode that is necessary. Sometimes there's nothing you can do about it, but also developing site translation skills improves your other skills, simultaneous, I mean, I have many years of experience, but until today, if I have a court interpreting assignment, I spend an hour sight translating documents to prepare myself for the simultaneous interpreting assignment that I'm going to do later on. So sight translation is a good practice overall. It gives you flexibility, it increases your vocabulary, it increases your confidence. So if you haven't done it yet, or you're afraid of doing it, consider starting.
Excellent. So it's transferable skills, especially for simultaneous. So I wanted to address one specific aspect of one of the questions that you read, Carola. What about consent forms in medical settings? So I personally think that the OSIT guidelines for clinicians are clever. So if it's necessary to fill out a written document, we're talking about consent forms. This has legal consequences. So what should happen is that the request of the clinician, the nurse, the doctor, should read the portions they want to read to the patient, and then they are going to complete the form according to the answers of the patient as conveyed in consecutive by the interpreter. So this could be a way to explain the requester, oh, I suggest, because it's a consent form, that we proceed like this for the best outcome possible, right?
Thank you so much for that response, given that it's 12:31 and I want to be mindful of time. And thank you all for participating. And I also want to thank Laurence and Cristiano for being here and so generously sharing their knowledge, expertise, and experience with all of us.